water expert per se. Don't have a scientific background. My thing is not really water policy even. Where I come into this is around an interest from a social work background in community organization, and increasingly an interest in community organizing and social action that happens kind of at that intersection between social justice and ecological sustainability. And I think that this struggles for water justice, including struggles around bottled water, are a really excellent example of that. For me, who's interested in studying, the emergence of social movements, what's happening around water bottling and the community response to it in Guelph, Ontario, and the area where people are really seem to be turned on about water. It's an interesting thing for me to look at, kind of a microcosm of a bigger phenomenon. So I'm going to be switching back and forth between some PowerPoint and this format. It's not going to be graceful, but we'll see how it works, so bear with me. I'll take pauses once in a while to see if there are any burning questions or clarifications that are really needed before I go on. I plan to try to keep my remarks to about 40 minutes, maybe less if I can, and then take questions. I'd like to have time for questions and answers after that. But put your questions in the chat box and make snide comments if you want to, and sarcastic jokes. Use the chat box to make this interactional if we can. Okay, so I guess I'd start by saying that really I think there are bigger, more urgent water issues facing us than for-profit water bottling. Is that sacrilegious to say that? I think, for example, boil water advisories and other water justice issues in Indigenous communities. Six Nations just down the road here, the largest reserve within the boundaries of Canada. Only 9% of the households have clean, fresh water piped into the houses. 9% here in southwestern Ontario. There are places where chemical contamination means you can't drink the water. Think Grassy Narrows, think Elmira, Ontario, where the groundwater has been poisoned since the 80s at least. The aggregate industry uses way more water than water bottlers take, and they introduce all kinds of other risks to groundwater protections as well. There's a push towards privatization of water services and wastewater services that keeps coming back wave after wave. Hamilton experienced one in the 90s. I don't know if people were around and remember news of the basements flooded with sewage at the end of that experiment. Mapleton, Ontario right now is considering public-private partnerships or P3s for water infrastructure. So there are some big issues like that, and I think that certainly people in Guelph and many of those who associate themselves with Wellington Water Watchers over the years have been and still are involved on many of those issues. But the major lightning rod for mobilization and protest around water issues in Guelph, which I find interesting over the past decade or so, and as most of you tuning in here would likely know, has been this. Now let me see if I can make my PowerPoint work for me. Present now. It's going to be melodramatic, or it's going to be underwhelming at the end of this. So many steps. Might have to limit how many times I bounce back and forth. So it's been this. There it is, right there. Boom. There are, I think, all kinds of reasons that people dislike water bottling. There are also reasons why people dislike Nestle in particular. But rather than trying to recite them all, what I think I'm going to try to do is to consolidate just a few thoughts around problems caused or represented by groundwater taking for bottling. I'm going to spend a little bit of time in particular around the concept of water scarcity. And in the process, I'm hoping that I'll be able to get everyone up to date on the position we're in right now in regards to groundwater taking for bottling here in Ontario. And then make a pitch for how we might general approach to deal with this issue and what our actions might mean for tackling the bigger problems of climate change. Can I get back to you now? So I think the way to come at this is to start kind of at the beginning, which is for this story, 2000, when Nestle Waters bought Aberfoyle Springs. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time laying out this history. We do have a kind of interactive timeline that you can scroll through that you can find on the Wellington Water Watchers homepage under About. Lays out some of the major events in the Battle of Groundwater in Wellington County from 2000 to 2018. I'll post a link to that in the chat. See if that works. Now I want to go back to presenting. So this is what the timeline looks like, and all these links take you to further information where you see a plus sign. Click on that, they'll drill down to yet another layer of information. I think it's a pretty cool tool, but I mean, I would say that because I created this with the assistance of Leah Connor, lives in Kitchener, who was a student in our program. But to get back to so check that out when you have a minute. Some cool archival materials that you can get to through that tool. To get back to our story, though. Okay, so Nestle purchases Aberfoyle Springs in 2000, establishes Nestle Waters Canada, and with that purchase, they get a well in Hillsburg, in Erin Township. They also get a well and a bottling plant, and later their national headquarters down in Aberfoyle in Pushlands Township, as well as that they also get at that time they got a bottling plant and a well in scenic Hope, BC. But it really wasn't until late 2006 that somebody in the community really took notice and raised the alarm, leading to the founding of Wellington Water Watchers and a major campaign 2007-2008 to oppose Nestle's application for a provincial permit to take water for bottling. If you're taking 50,000 liters or more, you have to apply to the Ministry of the Environment and its various iterations and name changes to get the permit. Now, Nestle eventually did get its permit, and it got subsequent permit renewals that continue still. But the whole thing around 2007, 2008 really got the community riled up, established the Wellington Water Watchers, and the Wellington Water Watchers has been at it ever since. So now, just to fast forward through history, and there is, again, in addition to that timeline, there's a oral history of the Wellington Water Watchers on the Wellington Water Watchers site that you can look at for more detail if you're interested. But fast forwarding to 2015, summer of 2015, Nestle Water saw an opportunity and decided to expand its operations in Wellington County by buying what's known as the Middlebrook Well on Middlebrook Road, just outside of Elora in Center Wellington Township. And from there, the plan was to apply for a permit to take up to another 1.6 million liters to truck down to the Aberfoyle Plastics facility for bottling. But there'd actually been a lot of controversy around this well for a long time, going back to at least the early 2000s. And a lot of questions were generally about where and how Center Wellington is going to get the water it needs to support the population growth slated for it by the province. In fact, there was even famously around 2016, I think it was, an attempt by the township itself to purchase that well that Nestle now owns. And as soon as people in Center Wellington heard about Nestle's interest in the Middlebrook well, they got organized, and particularly got organized through a group called Save Our Water, which has done a really brilliant job of raising awareness in the community, gathering scientific information, and working politically on this issue. And so Save Our Water, along with Wellington Water Watchers, and a kind of growing array of friends and allies and networks, managed to raise enough stink around this Middlebrook well that not only was former Premier Kathleen Wynne compelled to impose a 2-year moratorium on new permits to take water for bottling and permit expansions, along with some positive but somewhat insufficient regulatory changes. The activism managed to get that going. But not only that, but there is so much of a stake and generated enough political buy-in from the township, town council, that even the incoming Conservative government, to everyone's surprise, extended the moratorium, first for a year, and then more recently for an additional 9 months, which ends October 1st, 2020. So we're in a bit of a window now. All right. I want to get back so I can't see you when I'm presenting that way. Just give you a little bit of a few more sources here, a little information on Senator Wellington. Okay. So just to be clear about this, Nestle does own that well, but so far they have not been able to pump water there because of the moratorium. The moratorium itself came about as a direct result, really, of grassroots advocacy and activism. That's the good news. And we now have until October this year to figure out how we're going to make the moratorium permanent. So I've been posting in bits and pieces as we go along. How's it going in the chat to there, Reshma? Anything I need to respond to, you think? Or you're muted?
Sorry, yeah. So we had one question from Paul. He asked, why did Nestle choose Guelph in particular? Is there a reason?
That's a good question. I don't really know. We like around here, we like to say it's because our water is so good. Same reason John Sleeman chose to set up shop here. I suppose there are all kinds of reasons. Maybe the proximity to the 401 for getting the water out of here. I don't know, but it's an interesting question. And now they kind of seem to be spreading through Wellington County. Okay, so there are bigger environmental issues maybe, but I think also even with the big existential threat of climate change, maybe particularly because of it, I think there also are compelling reasons to see this particular issue through. And I don't know if people want to add their comments in the chat about the reasons why they think water bottling is a problem. That'd be most welcome. I'd be curious to see that. But certainly there are concerns, like some people are concerned about the health and safety of bottled water compared to with the more highly regulated municipal water systems. There are concerns about, for example, the ways in which the availability and marketing of bottled water undermines confidence in public municipal water systems, in a way shifting responsibility for the delivery of safe, clean water away from the public sector into the private domain. It's a concern for many. There's a cost element where bottled water can be anywhere from 3 to 6 or more, 3 to 600 or more times more expensive than bottled water. But of course, one of the big concerns is, and growing concern, is the plastics involved. Industry lobbyists, of course, like to point out that the single-use plastic bottles are nearly 100% recyclable. Though estimates of how many actually get recycled in Ontario range from 70 to 75%, according to the industry, which isn't that great a record if you think about it, to as little as 14% from the Polaris Institute. And let me just get back to a couple of slides here again. A couple more resources for you in case anyone's interested. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so if you consider that in 2018, I'm just talking about the plastics here. If you consider that in 2018, Nestle bottled a little over 746 million liters of water. That's an actual number from their monitoring reports. and in a slow year, actually, well below their permitted amount, you start to really get a sense of the scale of the issue. And we don't know exactly how many bottles actually left that Aberfoyle plant, but for easy, reasonable estimation, let's assume that all their bottles, all the water is bottled in their popular 500 milliliter size. In actual fact, there's some larger bottles, there's some smaller bottles, but let's, for easy calculation, say the half-liter size. So that's 2 bottles per liter, right? Which leaves us with just under 1.5 billion plastic bottles in 1 year, just from that one plant, from that one company. So actually kind of an extraordinary amount of plastic being spewed out there. And again, I can't vouch for the exact numbers, but it's a lot of plastic that could actually be reduced by eliminating this industry. But the water waste itself is only part of the story. As many of you are, I'm sure, aware, it takes oil to make plastic. A 2009 study by the Pacific Institute found that it takes something like 2,000 times the amount of energy to produce and deliver water, to produce and deliver bottled water than tap water, 2,000 times more energy. And estimated at that time that it took something like 50 million liters of oil to produce the single-serve bottles needed for the US bottled water industry alone. And that was 2009. And with the growth of the industry, you can imagine that the numbers have also grown, the numbers of barrels of oil. So huge climate impact per liter of water. So these are all pretty important reasons, I think, for opposing water bottling. But what about the water taking itself becomes the question. What about the amount of water taken? And underlying the reaction against groundwater taking for bottling, pretty much wherever this industry is contested, are themes of concern regarding long-term availability of water, the export of water from the local watershed, people often say, and ultimately about running out of water due, at least in part, to the water bottling industry. This is the idea that water bottlers are going to suck our aquifers dry, or at least keep pumping until every single drop is gone. Now, that's really not happening in Ontario, at least not at this point. But certainly there are cases of water bottlers taking so much water in some places around the world that it deprives locals of their water sources. And Coca-Cola in Pletchermata, India, is a really well-documented case of this. But so is Vidal, France, where they say water bottling was invented. Another troubling example where water mining for bottling, in this case, actually Nestle itself, has been implicated in water tables dropping to the point where the township was going to have to build a pipeline to bring water from elsewhere into the town for its residents, while Nestle continued to pump and bottle water. Similarly, some of you might remember news of Nestle continuing to pump water in California in the midst of that terrible 2015 drought on long expired permits, by the way. And you might also recall that when called on it in an interview, Nestle Water's CEO finally declared that, he would actually increase the amount if he could. And so again, we're, at least as far as we could tell, at least so far, this isn't the case in Ontario, though it is, I think, instructive to realize from these examples that the bottom line drive for profit maximization means that companies like Nestle cannot put water or environmental stewardship ahead of profits unless they're forced to by regulation and the ability to enforce it. And luckily, we do have a regulatory regime in Ontario, and we actually have a moment now when we can hopefully improve it. More generally, let me get back. I want to be able to see you here. I have a couple more references in here for you. Where generally we know that we have to do a better job of looking after our groundwater resources kind of world over. There is, really sort of dire-looking research conducted by Jay Famiglietti with the help of NASA aerial or satellite photographs showing how major aquifers around the world are under great strain because we're withdrawing water from them faster than they can recharge. In fact, we're doing that at an accelerating pace. And largely, according to that research, it seems to be due to insufficient or even non-existent regulation. We know also from research by a team at UVic led by Tom Gleason, I think I put a reference in the chat there, that takes an extraordinarily long time for groundwater to recharge. So we do need to get smarter about how quickly we're extracting groundwater. But what the water bottling industry and some very credible water experts point out is that actually water bottling is actually just a tiny, tiny little part of the picture. How's it looking in the chat there? Anything, any burning issues that people need to know about?
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions, but I think it can wait till the end.
Okay.
You want to keep going?
Okay.
Yeah.
People are okay with that. Here's a chart that from the Grand River Conservation Authority that kind of makes that point about where water bottling fits in. I don't know if you can see at the top. Let me try to point out there. Water bottling only counts for 0.6% of the water taken in the Grand River region. This is something, of course, that the Canadian Water Bottling Association and other industry-funded organs like that like to point to all the time when they can. Bottlers just are not a major water taker. While Nestle's permitted amount of 4.7 million liters per day sounds like a lot, it's nothing compared, for example, with the city of Guelph's take of over 50 million liters per day, or golf courses, or the aggregate industry, which pumps a great deal more groundwater for dewatering and for washing aggregate. Lafarge, in fact, has an application before the ministry right now to amend a permit. They have to take water at one of their sites near Guelph, an aggregate pit, so that they can take up to 21.5 million liters of water per day. And that's just one quarry. And quarries are proliferating around the province as we speak. So why focus on bottling? And I guess for me, the obvious answer is because there are so many. If you look at this chart, what I see is not exactly that water bottling is a negligible amount, but that there's so many competing water takers, so many straws in the glass that something's got to give. And as far as water bottling goes, it really seems to add so little to society relative to the pollution and the risks and harms that it introduces. It is true, you can see there the largest taker is municipalities. But municipalities, they take a lot more water, but they supply tens of thousands of households and hospitals and schools and all kinds of value-added industry. And they do so, I might add, without clogging our waterways with plastic. The concept of water scarcity, in fact, is quite a highly contested one in the academic literature. What dominant narratives and frames of water scarcity and policy debates tend to do, exemplified in this chart, is to prioritize purely quantitative metrics. How much water? And thereby, they take out of the assessment any kind of consideration of equity or social justice in the distribution of water, or the appropriation of source water or control over source water by powerful interests and the wealthy. While the amounts might look small in comparison with other water-taking activities in the region, for Centre Wellington, where there's that contested site, 1.6 million liters actually is the amount they use for the entire township right now. And it's enough to accommodate the population growth that's predicted for the township as well. The problem, though, according to the research that I've been shown, is that if Nestle gets its permit and starts pumping at the Millbrook site, the township is going to have a really hard time accessing the water it needs for growth in the very near future. And so it's not really about how much water there is. From what I've been told, there seems to be a fairly strong consensus that there's plenty of water down there for everybody, at least for now. The problem is who controls access to it. You can't just stick a hole in the ground anywhere and get the flow required to service the whole municipality. And what the research up there suggests, at least what I've been explained to me, is that given the Millbrook Well's location relative to the hydrogeological dynamics of the area, it will seriously constrain the municipality's access to the water it needs for a growing community if someone else, like Nestle, starts pumping water there first. The city of Guelph analysis similarly found that with that growing city, Nestle's pumping operations in Aberfoyle could come into competition with public needs there in as little as 20 years. So we need good science to inform and support policy advocacy and policy development. We need to know how much water is available for use, but when we start to think of water rights purely in terms of volumetric assessments, or primarily in terms of volumetric assessments of availability, we reduce what is really a question of values and priorities down to a question of mathematics, and we can easily find ourselves drawn into a policy debate that kind of misses the point. We tend, I think, often to think of water scarcity as simply a problem of too little water to meet needs. But when it comes to groundwater taking, I think the question of is there enough water really needs to be followed up with questions like for what and for whom, on what principles will it be distributed, and what will be the consequences of the water taking. We know from places like El Alto and Cochabamba, Peru, from Highland Park, Michigan, from Paris, France, even from Hamilton, Ontario, that the profit motive is an inefficient means of distributing water or dealing with wastewater in the case of the Hamilton experience, if the priority, rather than profit maximization, is the reliable, affordable, equitable delivery of safe, clean water to residents. The profit motive doesn't quite carry it. Capitalism thrives on scarcity and even on the perception of scarcity. It depends on it. It pursues and actively creates it by undermining public goods, like public drinking fountains, by transferring public assets into private hands through what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, like arguably happened at the Millbrook Well, or through the commodification of all things, as Karl Marx himself would have said, where even those things that we need for our very survival, like water, things that we take for granted as freely available according to need, are converted into an item for exchange and distribution according to the logic of profit and capital accumulation, rather than according to social or ecological values or needs. And so while water bottlers may not be the biggest water users in our region, if we consider the stress already placed on groundwater supplies the world over and start thinking about future needs in the context of population growth, development, economic growth, and particularly climate change, I think it's not hard to come to the conclusion that starting right now, we need to start bringing into the permanent stake water system the question of not just whether there is concrete evidence that the withdrawal will directly impact water flows in the aquifer. Let me say that again. We need to bring into the permanent stake water system the question of not just whether there is concrete evidence that the withdrawal will directly impact water flows in the aquifer, as is our permanent stake water system based on. We have to show evidence that it'll cause damage. But also we need to ask whether there are better alternatives available and whether the benefits of the proposed water taking outweigh the climate impacts and the harms and risks that are introduced. While we really need to look at all water takers in that regard, given the convergence of so many issues relative to the negligible good produced, we can start by cutting out bottled water in our province now. And so I'm drawing close to wrapping up here. We're okay in the chat so far? Rashmi, anything that needs to be clarified, or should I keep going?
We have some questions, but I think we can take them all at the end. Okay. Is that okay? Yeah.
If anyone starts screaming in the chat, then I can take it, but let's keep going here. Then here's one more source I want to give you in the chat. So you have that. This is the reference for the chart that I just showed you. I guess I'll switch over to presentation again, just for a couple of slides. before and I think before I kind of wrap up, move to what it is that we can do. I just want to sort of make a comment here that despite my earlier land acknowledgement, I realize that I've actually said very little about the relationship between water bottling and Indigenous water rights or water issues in Indigenous communities. I hesitate to say much, quite frankly, because I'm far from being an expert in that area, and I, along with the Wellington Water Watchers, are just kind of beginning a process of learning in that regard. But nonetheless, it's particularly with the Millbrook Well, which lies smack dab in the middle of the Haldeman Tract, that 10 kilometers of land on either side of the Grand River that is supposed to be under the control of the Six Nations of the Grand River. Particularly with Nestle's purchase of that well, the irony of a corporation, big multinational corporation, pumping water to sell, pumping water from there to sell for such a frivolous example of private gain from a jurisdiction in which the majority of households have no access to clean water, especially when that water taking appears to generate no benefits to that community, and in fact, where profits can even be leveraged by selling water back to that water needy community. The irony is really hard to ignore. But of course, Indigenous water rights don't start or finish at the boundaries of any one treaty with any single nation or confederacy. Both the Haudenosaunee and people in various Anishinaabe communities have traditional claims to territories and rights that go well beyond what's circumscribed in that Haldeman Treaty, and rights that really bring into question the very legitimacy of the political institutions and processes that we use to permit water taking of any kind in the first place, and bring into question our systems of governing water in general, the legitimacy of them. I can only imagine that opinions about water bottling vary as much among people of the Six Nations as they do in any community, but I can share with you this on the screen, one perspective that comes from the traditional leadership of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This was delivered to senior managers of Nestle Waters Canada in the context of a rally outside the Nestle front gates back in June 2019. A rally that brought together labor and environmentalists and a delegation of Six Nations. And essentially what it is a cease and desist order from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that asserts their territorial rights and expresses support for Six Nations youth who are leading opposition in that community to Nestle's water taking. So really just a reflection of a much broader, complex problem of colonization, but yet another layer to add to the examination of what's wrong with for-profit water bottling in Ontario. So briefly then, in the last few minutes, what can we do about this? Well, there are all kinds of things that can and should be done, from changing cultural attitudes and consumer behaviors, right through to fundamentally transforming the economic and political institutions that govern water taking and our society in general, actually. And that's kind of a long-term proposition that we need to move towards. But in the meantime, the moratorium on new permits to take water provides us, I think, with an opportunity to make a tangible, concrete shift in policy in the right direction. We can, if we're strategic in our efforts, use this moment to bring an end to water bottling in Ontario. It's organizing and activism that created the moratorium in the first place. And so here are the 4 demands that the Wellington Water Watchers and allies have been working with. All of this is subject to change and input over time. But the first one is to start by demanding that our government deny permits to take water in Wellington County, not just because it's our home county, where I live, but also because it's where the majority of water bottling is happening in Ontario. Secondly, and probably maybe most importantly, is demand that our government initiate the process now of phasing out this industry. But to do it over a time period that allows for a just transition for workers and retailers who depend on this industry for their livelihoods. Thirdly, demand that our government require free, prior, informed consent of relevant Indigenous communities as part of the permitting process, as per our country's commitment to under the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and take measures in policy and practice that keep water in the public sphere. These are things our provincial government has the jurisdiction to do. Our government can deny current applications for water taking permits. There's no reason they have to give them out, particularly the new one for the Middlebrook well in Center Wellington. Our government can initiate a phase out of this industry beginning October 1st at the end of the moratorium. And while convening science and argumentation needed to support this policy direction is really important, I think it's also important to remember that science and rational argumentation are not enough on their own to affect policy or social change. If they were, climate change would be well on its way to being resolved by now. What's required, I think history tells us, to affect policy change in our system of representative democracy in particular is pressure. What is required in order to make progressive change is for us to hold elected representatives to account, to take charge of our democratic institutions, and when these systems fail, to create new ones that reflect informed, rational, genuinely democratically determined values and priorities. It was public pressure that caused the provincial government to enact the moratorium on permits to take water in the first place. And it's public pressure that will be needed again this fall to convince particularly this current government, or if necessary, the next one, the one after, to follow through on and start phasing out this industry. It means communicating where you stand on this issue to your elected representatives at the municipal and especially the provincial level, letting them know where you stand directly to the press through public demonstrations. Here's an initiative of the Save Our Water that's going on right now, where they're inviting people to display how they feel about Nestle to make sure this issue is seen as alive and important still in the community. And so I'm not asking you to abandon your work on other, quite possibly more urgent and important points of action. What this does mean is mobilizing your network, so to add your voices to this policy effort. And in the process, hopefully we can start to build and strengthen those civil society relationships and the momentum we need to support each other in all of our efforts. A good place to start is by following the progress of a campaign that the Wellington Water Watchers is just getting ready to launch that we're calling the People's Water Campaign. I've just got a couple more minutes here, so bear with me. The idea of this campaign is basically to bring together networks and individuals from across the province who share an interest in water justice, broadly defined, and to use the October 1st moratorium deadline as kind of like a focal point around which to build collaborative relationships among us and to really kickstart a longer-term program of collective action on a broad range of water justice issues. And so I would strongly recommend that people watch Wellington Water Watchers social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Watch for details of as this campaign unfolds. Don't have to wait to start telling your friends and neighbors and your elected representatives how you feel about the permit to take water system in relation to bottling water. But watch the social media for those moments when coordinated action is called for, and then join the action and spread the call through your organizations too. I believe, and there's academic literature that will back me up on this, that is through engagement together in collective action on a concrete, tangible target, such as the permit to take water system. It's through that we can hope to build the relationships, the analyses, the ideas, the strategies, and the momentum that we need to push beyond this one industry in this one province toward reclaiming and reconstituting grassroots democratic control over the decisions that affect us and affect the planet we live on. So let's engage with the momentum already surrounding opposition to bottled water. Let's deal with the problem of groundwater taking for bottling as a province, and then let's harness and build on that momentum towards bigger issues and towards building a sustainable and just future. Thanks. I'm imagining thunderous applause. Thank you.
All right, so I think we'll start with the questions in the chat, and then we can open it up to anyone who has additional questions. The first question is, have sales of bottled water dropped locally since Wellington Water Watchers started their campaign? Have you managed to convince local people to stop buying bottled water?
Sorry, what was the second part of that?
have you managed to convince local people to stop buying bottled water?
It's a really good question. The Nestle's business, the water bottling business locally, has declined significantly over the last couple of years. It went down 2018. I said it was a slow year. 2019 was an even slower year. Sales have decreased. Nestle laid off something like I think 30 people out of whatever 150 who work at that plant last year because of it. So bottled water sales, or Nestle's bottled water sales at least, have declined. Unfortunately, we don't really have any way of knowing whether or how much of an influence that is of Wellington Water Watchers and associated people. We don't even know if perhaps people are just switching brands to some other water bottle beverage or whatever. So it's really hard to tell. We do spend a lot of time in the community trying to. I mean, we're not really an organization that tries to act judgy and put people down for their choices. But we do spend a lot of time in the community trying to inform people of myths surrounding bottled water and tap water, trying to promote public water services and those sorts of things that influence a shift towards rejecting bottled water that way. When Wellington Water Watchers first started, we distributed reusable, refillable canteens. That became a bit of a symbol for, if you were a legitimate downtown eco hipster in Guelph, you better have one of those things at your side with the Wellington Water Watchers logo on it. People drifted away. It was not cool to get bottled water. And so it's a very, very good question that I'd love to have some help figuring out how to study what influence has been that way. So there's a long-winded way of saying, I don't really know.
All right. So the second question, do you know why people keep buying bottled water? Has it increased during COVID-19?
Well, bottled water sales for sure did increase, at least at the beginning of COVID-19. I'm not really sure why. I guess people are worried that it's going to be so bad that municipal utilities would be abandoned or something like that. I'm not really sure. People are still buying bottled water by the caseload, and why is a bit of a mystery. There, studies that have been done. People will say that they do it for the taste. They prefer the taste, even though when blind taste tests are done, usually people can't really tell which is bottled water, which is tap water. Some people do it out of, we were canvassing people up in Mount Forest in the northern part of the county. People there, I guess, close enough to Walkerton and its history, people fear government-run utilities sometimes, but somehow trust the less regulated private market. I think there are a whole bunch of reasons why people buy bottled water. And I think for some people it's become a habit. But I would also like to understand that it's continues to be a mystery to me the more I ask people about it, to tell you the truth.
All right, so third question. Given the current health crisis in long-term care and the resulting increased public scrutiny around the dangers of allowing private interest to profit from public services, do you think this might be a watershed moment for increased scrutiny and the privatization of public goods such as water?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of, when it comes to water and privatization, there's kind of two things going on that we should be concerned about. And one is the Council of Canadians are really good on this particular topic, but the Infrastructure Renewal Bank, can anyone help me with the name of it? There's a federal agency set up to support municipalities in renewing their infrastructure. And within that mechanism are preferential rates and benefits if municipalities entertain public-private partnerships. So there's, like the Stephen Harper Conservatives did during the 2008 economic meltdown, they dangled like this money for infrastructure renewal in front of municipalities with aging infrastructure, and they dangle like these little inducements to bring in a private partner. So it's being promoted. I think that's where Mapleton is getting on this idea of public-private partnership. So that's one thing. I think also it's a really good, I think, poignant, insightful question, because right now in the midst of this crisis, we're seeing in this province some rolling back of environmental protections, procedures that development has to go through in order to get a permit, and those sorts of things by this conservative government. So that's a pretty classic political maneuver in the midst of chaos to kind of roll this back. And I think we should be prepared to see a lot more of that as we get to the end of the COVID emergency. We start to open up the economy. Let's not forget that in spite of how, relatively speaking, well, this government has responded, this provincial government has responded to the COVID crisis, they are elected as a bringing business to Ontario neoliberal government. And I think we can expect, as the economy opens up and we start to rev the engines up, a lot more of this shifting to privatization, deregulation of industry, finding ways to save money, public monies through cuts to public services and those sorts of things. I think we can probably expect to see on the environmental side and the social side a full-bore neoliberalism if they can get away with it. So I'm not sure if that quite answers the question, kind of around the question, but it's a really good one, because I do think that when I said at the beginning that I think these water struggles are a microcosm of broader phenomena, that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's an example of a public-private struggle and shift.
So the next question is, how do we get a conservative government to stand with people in the future rather than industry?
Yeah, it's a hard one, but we basically we have to make them. We have to work together. We need to mobilize on, find key issues that we can mobilize communities around. I think the aggregate extraction thing is maybe a good one, because this government has liberalized, deregulated the aggregate industry to make way for rapid development. And people generally hate having gravel pits and sand pits in their communities. It's like a lot of blasting, heavy trucks, all kinds of stuff, noise. And a lot of those are actually happening in conservative ridings. And I think these are the kind of things that we need to get people organized to understand, that it's not just about your backyard. This is a policy question that is actually being made worse by the government elected in your riding. So I think there is opportunity right now to broaden the way that we organize, to get out to those conservative ridings, to find the right causes that people can get behind, to put pressure on the government and let them know that come election time, we are thinking we need an alternative. It's the only way that we can actually, within the system, make a change. There's no convincing. Ideology doesn't change because of good information. Information received changes because of ideology. What we need to do is apply pressure as an electorate, I guess, and make a lot of noise and push and make it impossible for them to ignore. This conservative government, I will say, has had to retreat on certain things around Greenbelt, opening up the Greenbelt, for example, to development, and a few other things like that when enough noise is made. I think that's what we need to do.
So you have one more question from the chat. Can you briefly sketch out for us local mobilization strategies, some of the key challenges you faced, and the general idea of progress you made in the struggle against the giant?
So key strategies?
Local strategies and key challenges you faced.
I think over the years, Wellington Water Watchers has tried all kinds of things. We've tried delving into the science. We've tried responding through provincially created public response systems. And the thing that has worked best has been just good old-fashioned inundating the premier, the relevant minister, and the local MPPs with outrage, with postcards, with letters, with emails, with petitions, with demonstrations outside their place. That's really what has most recently seemed to trigger some change. You could see in the year that the Kathleen Wynne government instituted the moratorium, you could see over the course of the summer how her language, as we started to get traction and make a lot of noise, her language as the premier started to change towards, oh yeah, well, the permit to take water system actually is a little out of date, she started saying. And then she started saying the permit to take water system is out of date, especially when it comes to bottled water, things that we said. It actually started to, it became, and it was an election year, mind you, so a little bit more vulnerable, but it actually became, made it into one of those big issues that becomes risky politically to bother with or not bother with. So that's kind of been, it's the, rather than diving in as the expert on policy, we need those experts, but our strategy has been to try to broaden the range of people that get involved. I'd say the challenge has been figuring out how to, rather than, I don't know, doing our own thing and trying to bring people under our own umbrella, how do we connect responsibly and effectively with all kinds of other groups out there who are involved in climate action? Because there's a great range and array of people. How do we consolidate action, at least on key policy campaigns, without undermining and taking energy away from what they're doing? I think that's been for me a pretty important challenge. And how do we reach new communities and the diversity geographically and in every way of people that really need to weigh in on public issues? How do we broaden our outreach and resist the kind of echo chamber, inward-facing mobilization? So it's always been a bit tricky. We're getting a bit better at that, I think. So key strategies aren't. I guess strategy has been put pressure on the decision maker. Well, demonstrate outside of Nestle. Nestle is the opponent, but the government is the target. Where decisions to try to get a little bit more clear about where we're applying pressure. We can yell at Nestle and boycott them, and they'll, they won't like it very much. But the decision makers really is where we need to apply the pressure. Challenges is mobilizing enough of that energy, and there's a third part of that question.
A general idea of progress you've made.
The progress made?
Yes.
The progress made has been, I think, Wellington Water Watchers. Well, the progress is twofold. One is sort of the instrumental. I don't know if that's the right word. The concrete policy action, the shift. We've become representing a constituency of people that's enough that some parliamentarians pay attention to Wellington Water Watchers and associated bodies. It was really cool to see the Green Party leader, Mike Schreiner, who's also the MPP from this area, from Guelph, introduce a private members bill in Queen's Park, and to hear people from all parties talking about that and talking about the Wellington Water Watchers in that regard. So building, I think there's the policy shift, but more sustainable is the kind of momentum and the broad backing of lots and lots of people. That's been a major progress, I would say, that's going to sustain things into the future. And we want to build on that. We want to lend that to other related, particularly water issues. I think we've built up a social and even a technological infrastructure that's quite useful for campaigning. So I think that's where our main progress is.
All right, so we have one new question, and then we can open up. Has the Wellington Water Watchers initiated action against single-use plastics, as this could create a barrier for Nestle and other water bottlers?
That's a great question, and we haven't actually gone directly onto that. We have on occasion contributed to campaigns at both the federal level. I think there's some action happening, and provincially. It hasn't been one that we have led, but I think that is really, we have tried to pay attention to it, partner with environmental defense and other groups like that to try to push that through, because I totally agree that the plastics is a vulnerability for the bottled water industry. But it's I hear it as a suggestion, an encouraging suggestion, actually. And I think I know who asked that question, so we'll have to connect for a physically distant coffee or a beer in the near future and talk it through a bit more.
All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? You can unmute and ask now. All right, I'm gonna take that as a no. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Rob. Oh, do you have anything else to say?
No, just thanks so much for sticking it through and for really good questions. And hopefully I'll be able to have a chance to look at the, for saying nice things in the chat thing too. Hopefully I'll have a chance to look through the chat board and get back to people at a later date. So thanks.
Yeah, so this recording will be available. We don't know when, but it will be available at some online platforms later. So watch out for that. But I just want to thank you, Rob, for this enlightening presentation. I'm sure all of us learned so much. You talked about the history of the problem in Guelph, the consequences that are not very obvious to us, and what we as citizens can do to help the cause. It's very inspiring to have people like you fighting for this cause, and it brings home the message that everyone can do something for the cause that they want.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you also to Renaissance for making this happen. We have Susan Carroll joining us next week for another talk on memorial tattoos. So if you are interested, sign up for that. Other than that, I wish you all a very good night. Thank you so much for coming. This is our first time having a huge audience for a talk, but I think it went really well. But if you have any feedback, just let us know. Okay? All right. Have a good night.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.